Hey, what's up, everybody? Jason Old here, the surfing historian. For today's episode, it's going to be brief, but I just wanted to field some questions that I got from a listener about my research in particular. And these questions come from a listener in Canada. Shout out to Canada, of course. Thank you guys for tuning in and staying stoked with us here at the Surfing Historian. And, the question is, I know your research is about Nicaragua, and I really enjoyed your podcast episode on your research, but could you explain a little bit more about some of the first surfers in Nicaragua and how that history unfolded? Yeah, absolutely. And really, when we talk about the first known surfer in Nicaragua, we have to start with Arturo Molieri, Nicaraguan, who actually in the early 60s was working with Pan Am Airways. And, in traveling between Managua and the United States, let's say LA and Miami and places like that, of course, got, swept up by the surfing craze that was taking place in the 1960s, particularly in places like LA, Malibu and all these different places. So as someone who worked with Pan Am, he would go back and forth. And, I would imagine at one point got aboard in California, came back to Nicaragua, and in the 60s in Nicaragua, I'm sure many people were, they were very unfamiliar with the sport, and so I can imagine him going to the beach with, a surfboard and people, kind of looking at him like, what are you doing? And so, but nevertheless, he surfed in the 60s and he ended up teaming up with a couple Americans, one of whom was actually the son of the ambassador at the time. And so they really were one of the first cohorts, if you will, of surfers in Nicaragua, or known surfers at the time. And so, of course, keep in mind, I'm basing this off of oral histories and different information I was able to get. So, I also recognize that there's individuals that may have made their way to Nicaragua and surfed in these periods I'm talking about that, I was certainly unaware of. But nevertheless, those are the individuals who surfed in the 60s. In the 70s, you get another group of really affluent Nicaraguans who, one of whom, for example, Carlos Deshawn, who I write a lot about in my dissertation, in my research, he went to school in California and Louisiana, and of course, became obsessed with surfing and really brought that back to Nicaragua. And a lot of the reconnaissance he did, particularly in the 70s, in the wake of the Sandinista Revolution, which was July of 1979, so sort of in the wake of that, he actually did a lot of reconnaissance living in the department of Rivas, where now it's home to the Tola municipality, which is considered to be a surfing municipality. He was able, in driving around during the agrarian reform and things like that, he was able to sort of, let's say, find different surf spots and places like that. And of course, as an avid and obsessed surfer, he was able to, take advantage of these places. And of course, he eventually brought along a lot of his friends, most of whom were Nicaraguan. One of their friends was actually Guatemalan. But nevertheless, again, we're talking about a cohort of, by and large, Nicaraguans, affluent Nicaraguans. And so as the 80s starts to, really with the 80s, you have the Contra War, which was Ronald Reagan's war that he waged against the Sandinista revolutionary government. Things became extremely challenging, and it was a very tumultuous and even bloody time in Nicaragua. It was rife with conflict and war. And so, but nevertheless, these individuals would still make their way to places like Popoyo and, Tola more broadly, and surf against the backdrop of this very tumultuous time in Nicaraguan history. Of course, it's worth adding that in the late 80s, a friend and journeyman, Brazilian Adrian Kojin, made his way through Nicaragua on a motorcycle journey where he was going from California to Brazil and surfing. And so, in the height of the Contra War, he's trying to navigate Nicaraguan surf. He surfed places like Puerto Sandino and other places. And of course, I talk about that in a different podcast. But yeah, as we get out of the 80s, and into the 90s into a time of peace where the conflict ends. In Nicaragua, the conflict ends in 1990. And so with the election of Violeta Chamorro, who won the election against Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista government. And so with that, Chamorro ushers in a more, let's say, U.S. sympathetic, Washington consensus sympathetic economic and political model for Nicaragua. And that really, while, in the beginnings, of course, a lot of foreign travelers, Americans in particular, weren't exactly enthusiastic about going to Nicaragua because they still, a lot of the media framed it still as very dangerous. But again, the conflict ends in 90. And you had at that time in the early 1990s, there was a trip done prior in 1991, but in 1992, Brock Little, Matt Archibald, and their entourage of videographers and photographers made their way to Nicaragua, and that's mapped out pretty well in a Surfer magazine article that I talk about in my dissertation. It was a magazine article that really traces their trip to Nicaragua. And it's worth noting that part of that Nicaraguan entourage included people like Carlos Deshawn and another surfer from that era, Ronald Oros. And so right there you see this sort of Nicaraguan surfers touring American surfers around, showing them all the breaks that they had surfed in the decade prior. And that really, that Surfer magazine article was pretty important for, let's say, Nicaragua as a viable option for surf tourism. You have another article in 1995. Doug Waters wrote an article where he and a group of surfers go to southern Nicaragua as well. It's basically the same area for the most part, San Juan del Sur and the Department of Rivas. And so again, that's in 1995, and towards the end of the decade, you then have other people curious, let's say, about Nicaragua. And one of those ends up being J.J. Yema, who, after doing a visa run from Costa Rica to Nicaragua, eventually makes his way to what is, what we all now call Popoyo. And, that in and of itself is worthy of a whole podcast, just the nuances of his arrival and purchasing land and all of that. But nevertheless, by 1999, he and his first wife, Kimberly Yema, open up Popoyo Surf Lodge in Playa Huasacate. And so that really is what I would call, or what I view as a watershed moment in the history of surfing for Nicaragua, because that's the very first surf camp, all-inclusive surf camp, that is really catering to this international clientele, if you will, of largely Americans, but of course others start to make their way there as well. But really, 1999 marks that turning point in terms of Nicaragua as a very viable surfing destination. And of course, it just continues to grow even through the present day. So another question that I have here is, are there any countries in that area that have a similar history? And this is going to be a much shorter answer, but the answer is yes. Just to the north of Nicaragua, sort of northwest, is El Salvador, who really had a very similar history in terms of conflict, ending with the peace accords in 1992, and then later emerging as they are currently in 2024 as what the current president Bukele is calling, particularly La Libertad in El Salvador, Surf City. So yeah, the conflict there ends in 1992 with the peace accords, and sort of a similar history there that, again, is worthy of a whole nother podcast in and of itself. But starting in 1992, the conflict ends, and El Salvador begins to sort of emerge from that. Of course, for those of you all who are listening that are familiar with the sort of history in the wake of that with the gangs and stuff, of course, that stunts El Salvador's growth as a potential surfing, international surfing hotspot. But nevertheless, in recent years, it's once again emerged as this on the map as this, destination for surfing. And so yeah, that's a quick answer. El Salvador is the perfect example of a country in that region that had a very similar situation in terms of conflict, but then later emerge as a surfing epicenter. So great question. Thank you for that, by the way. All right, and here's the third one. I read your article, Empire at Play, and I really enjoyed it. I'd really like to hear you, in your own words, explain how surfing, baseball, and boxing became such popular sports in Nicaragua. And so, that's a great question. And, as I was thinking about that article, it was really exciting to dig into that as a sports historian. And so really, again, to not make this a really long answer, first and foremost, on the Caribbean side of Nicaragua, they played cricket. It was part of the part of the broader, let's say, British Honduras, colonial British colony in the Caribbean. And so naturally, cricket was one of the sports they were playing, and it was actually an American businessman who was there in the late 1800s, 1880s, who, in his own words, essentially was tired of and bored of watching cricket, and essentially said, "Hey, I gotta try this. Let's try this sport out." Right? He probably had other choice words to describe cricket, but nevertheless, he essentially brought equipment to these folks, and they showed them the game, and they started playing and really embraced it. And of course, over time, the popularity of cricket waned, and the popularity of baseball continued to grow and proliferate. And so, but that also, fast forward another 15 plus years, 20 years, you have the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua, which starts in the early 1912 actually, and runs through the early 1930s. And so it's really at that time, and again, let me. It's worth mentioning this. If you read the Leatherneck, which is the newspaper from the Marines, there's some early publications that suggest that they introduced baseball to Nicaragua, and I would argue with that, in that it was, if we're talking about introducing the sport technically to Nicaragua, I think we have to give credit to the American businessman on the Caribbean coast. But what we really can credit the Marines for in terms of baseball in Nicaragua, and boxing as well, and so that brings me to the other sport, is they very much aided in its proliferation. In other words, while they were occupying Nicaragua militarily for the better part of 21 years, they also built baseball fields and things like that. And so in terms of cultural imperialism, their presence aided in the expansion and proliferation and popularity of baseball, and that's undeniable. And at this point, Nicaraguans are fanatics for baseball, and you can catch virtually anywhere in Nicaragua. The baseball fields are packed full on the weekends. On a Sunday, people are dressed up, and even in the most remote and rural parts, they take it very serious. Their presentation is serious, and of course they have a phenomenal national professional baseball league. But so boxing sort of grew in much of the same way. Nicaraguans saw the Marines boxing and were curious, and so again, through this American imperialism, both militarism and this cultural, let's say, imperialism, those two sports were introduced and then proliferated throughout the country in the early 1900s. Surfing comes around much later, for many of the reasons I talked about at the beginning of this Q&A, because surfing becomes a more popularized in a very significant way much later, even in the United States. So, and of course, this is ignoring its legacy in, say, Hawaii, which really dates back much longer, and they have a much more robust history of that. But I know this Q&A is not about Hawaii, but in terms of modern American surfing, or the appropriation of surfing by Americans and even Australians from the Hawaiians, that happens much later. So, and again, I addressed that at the beginning of this, but the come 1990s, with the change from the revolutionary government and their nation building project to a more neoliberal, pro-Washington consensus, pro-privatization government, that really opened the doors, or created an environment very much conducive to the introduction and proliferation of surfing by way of surf tourism and investment and all of these other things. And, I know I kind of talked about that earlier, but really that's how all three of those sports were introduced. And again, as we're making this podcast and pushing it out, surfing continues to grow in Nicaragua. It was essentially considered by the Nicaraguan National Assembly to be effectively a national sport, and fell underneath the purview of the Nicaraguan Institute of Sports in 2020. So it is now among the ranks of the baseballs, the boxings, and all of these other, the national sports of Nicaragua. So thank you so much for those questions. And thank you for reading that article. Thank you for your interest in my research. And that really means a lot. And hey, all of you guys out here listening to this, shoot us a message. By all means, send us your own questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So until then, stay stoked.